Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to do two centenarians. First, we're going to start off with Ieoh Pei, who died recently at the age of 102, probably the most important Chinese American of our generation, and one of the great, if not the greatest, architect of our generation. His career was made when Jackie Kennedy asked him to design the John F. Kennedy Memorial Library in 1964 after JFK was assassinated, and he went on to do everything from the new entrance to the Louvre to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Here's the story of Ieoh Pei.
My Chinese name is Yoh-ming. My Americanized name is initial IM, stand for Yoh-ming. So it's Ieoh Pei now because it's simple.
Ieoh Pei is one of the greatest modern architects of our time. Known for designing the Louvre Museum in Paris, France, the Bank of China Tower in Hong Kong, the Suzhou Museum in Suzhou, China, and countless other architectural treasures. He is a scholar and a visionary who has inspired countless generations with a legacy even more well known than the buildings he's designed.
He was really very well known, integrated himself into American society while still retaining the pride of being a Chinese representative. So he was always like a beacon to all Chinese Americans. And he came earlier, and yet he made a huge success of his career in his identity.
Ieoh was born on April 26, 1917 in Guangzhou, China. As a youth, he grew up admiring the architecture of Shanghai, and on August 13, 1935, at the age of 17, Pei boarded the steamship SS President Coolidge and sailed to the United States to study architecture. 2 weeks later, he arrived at Angel Island on August 28, 1935, with a student visa, and upon approval of his paperwork, took a train to Philadelphia to start his studies at the University of Pennsylvania.
I came as a student. I was treated so well, really amazingly well, especially by the professors. And I couldn't speak English when I first came, so I had the chance to learn by association. And the American friends helped me a lot.
When he arrived at the University of Pennsylvania, he discovered the architecture program was not what he had expected. Pei was fascinated by modern architecture and therefore decided to transfer to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
And when I was in college, I felt very privileged that people were interested in me. Rather than discriminating against me, they wanted to know more about who I was and who I am.
These first experiences in America would sow the seeds for what would become a lifelong mission to incorporate Pei's Chinese identity into his career, his adopted home in the U.S., and later to bridge U.S.-China relations. After school, Ieoh attempted to return to China, but World War II prevented his departure. This would turn out to be another pivotal, life-changing moment. On a trip visiting New York City, Pei met Eileen Liu, a Wellesley College student. They began dating and later married in the spring of 1942. They eventually had 4 children, 2 of whom became architects like their father. In 1942, a month into his graduate school enrollment, Pei suspended his work at Harvard to join the National Defense Research Committee, which produced scientific research on U.S. weapons technology during World War II. This proved his patriotism and deepened his connection to the United States.
If you know the man, he is a man of great sensitivity, man of very, very perceptive understanding of the counterparty, the other person, truly interested in what you have to say and your point of view. And ultimately, from what Mr. Pei used to tell me, it is even reflected in his work.
Pei's first successful major project was a 2-story building for Gulf Oil in Atlanta, Georgia, built in 1949.
I'm an architect, that's all. And not much more. But I'm a Chinese-American architect.
In 1954, he became a U.S. citizen. A year later, Pei opened his own New York-based architecture firm, Ieoh Ming Pei Associates, which eventually became Pei Cobb Freed Partners in 1989.
Ieoh at that time was running one of the largest architectural firms in the country. When I first met him, he opened the door and he showed me a room with 300 working architects. It was a drafting room with 300 people on drafting boards, and he was working on maybe a half a dozen major skyscrapers, famous buildings all around the world.
Pei has created some of the most influential buildings in the world, including the Louvre Museum in Paris, France, the John Hancock Building in Boston, the East Wing of the National Gallery, as well as the new Chinese Embassy in the U.S. In 1964, he was chosen by Jacqueline Kennedy to design the John F. Kennedy Library at Harvard University.
The idea that talent and commitment and hard work could achieve such very high results. We all looked up to him for that reason.
In 1983, Pei was awarded the Pritzker Prize Prize, which is often called the Nobel Prize of Architecture. He was also awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President George H.W. Bush in 1992. IM has achieved fame in architecture and politics, but he's also known for having an undeniable determination and passion for everything in life.
When he has an idea, somehow he's going to find a way to get it done.
In 1987, fate struck. Pei and Henry Kissinger met at a black tie event, setting the stage for a lifelong friendship.
IM appeared in my life when I started being active in the government, when he called on me at a time before relations had been established about the importance of China to the world.
At that event, Kissinger and Pei exchanged stories about working in China and their shared journey as immigrants rising as leaders in America. Dr. Kissinger encouraged Pei to consider organizing Chinese Americans like himself to address issues of international concern between the United States and China.
Tiananmen, I think, had happened. I think Americans at that time were really somewhat confused about what had happening. In fact, I was too. So in that sense, I think a few of us thought that we should take a position and try to explain.
Pei began to heed Kissinger's advice and turn his focus to reaching out to and convening Chinese Americans to discuss what had occurred in China.
He was the one person, perhaps, in the Chinese American community who had the capability to convene such a meeting.
It was the beginning of something. And I think we seem to have struck some kind of a chord that seemed to resonate. And a lot of people are curious about what's happening. Since 1989, that interest has multiplied.
By the end of 1990, the core group had recruited 40 other distinguished Chinese Americans from the arts, business, academia, public service, and the sciences to serve on the committee.
Even though he had been in America for so long, he was deeply upset by what happened in China, even though he frankly wasn't that close to China because he had been gone for so long and had some involvement, not that much. So he really helped to kind of guide us to make sure that we really put this group together for the future that would really look at US-China relations and to try and help in that regard.
In 1994, Pei led a delegation to China, where a half-dozen committee members met with Chinese President Jiang Zemin to discuss the state of US-China relations and share an American perspective.
Everyone's work is very, very important and contributes to the fabric of being Chinese in America and able to make a contribution.
Pei planted roots in the U.S. more than 80 years ago. His legacy flourishes with the 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren who are building Chinese-American narratives of their own.
My children, my grandchildren particularly, they're becoming more and more Americans. Chinese root is there, but how close could they get to that root? They should become American, they are. But I also want them to know that they came from somewhere that has a long history behind it. I know the history, but they don't. I think they have to learn about it themselves. A time will come that I hope that they will realize that, yes, I want to know. It will come, I think.
I.M. Pei is a scholar, a visionary, and inspiration to us all. The world will continue to admire and experience his legacy of masterful works. We all owe a debt of gratitude to I.M. Pei for trailblazing a path as a young Chinese immigrant in America who rose to fame as one of the world's most prolific architects. He continues to define greatness through creativity.
I came as a Chinese, I remain as a Chinese, but now I'm American Chinese.
Here's Dutch architect Stefan L. to talk more about I.M. Pei's work.
He had such a magnificent career. He lived to 102, and even in his retirement, he was still designing several buildings. A very prolific architect, but more importantly, he was an architect that achieved something that was really quite difficult. His style, on one hand, was very modern with clean geometric lines, almost universal, but at the same time, despite its universality, it was very much tailored to the local context. He was really able to bridge different cultures through his design, and he himself was a bridge, born in Asia, made his career in the West, and you can really see that cultural sensitivity in his work. I think some of his structures are really true icons, and probably the most famous building was the renovation for the Louvre. It's interesting to kind of realize the context when he was chosen to do this renovation, and he came up with this glass pyramid. At the time, it was very controversial. and most Parisians rejected the idea. But when it was built, it became an instant classic, and today is the example of how to do adaptive reuse. How can you build in a context that's heavy with history, in this case the Louvre, that had only been designed by French architects. You come in as a foreign architect and you do something that is extremely modern and contemporary, but yet classical and very sensitive to the local kind of condition and history. He picked a classical shape, a pyramid. It was a glass pyramid, so you were able to see through, and it was kind of reminiscent of 17th century French garden tradition, the triangular shapes. In a way, he managed to strike a chord that fit so well in that context that today is probably the best example of how to design in such kind of loaded historical conditions. So he himself was obviously influenced by the people he grew up with. He was educated by Walter Gropius, who was a revered modernist. Of course, he knew the work of modernist Le Corbusier and Louis Kahn, but he was able to depart from that, what they called international style that was supposed to be more or less the same everywhere, to something that actually became quite contextual. What's unique about Pei is that he didn't really follow any styles. He didn't really want to belong to one particular group of architects. He was really after building buildings that would stand the test of times, buildings that would be truly timeless. And I think that's probably why some of the buildings he left are known as such amazing icons, like the Bank of China Tower or the Louvre renovation in Paris.
We're going to move on now to Herman Wouk, another centenarian who died recently at the age of 103, nice Jewish boy from New York City, who was an author, and among other things, he wrote the Caine Mutiny, Marjorie Morningstar, and The Winds of War. Not that popular with the literary crowd, but very popular with the public. Here's NPR on Herman Wouk.
Many people might remember Herman Wouk for a certain incident involving strawberries.
But the strawberries, that's where I had them. They laughed at me and made jokes, but I proved beyond the shadow of a doubt and with geometric logic that a duplicate key to the wardrobe icebox did exist.
That's Humphrey Bogart in the 1954 adaptation of Wouk's novel The Caine Mutiny. Bogart played the tyrannical Captain Queeg, who has a breakdown at sea. He accuses the crew of stealing a quart of strawberries and becomes obsessed with finding the culprit. Bogart wasn't exactly what the author had in mind for Captain Queeg, as he told NPR in 2004.
My image of Captain Queeg was not Humphrey Bogart. But now, Captain Queeg is Humphrey Bogart. There's nothing you can do about it, and I'm perfectly content with that. It was one of the great performances, I think, in his career.
The Caine Mutiny was his most celebrated book, but Wouk had a substantial career both before and after it. He got his start in writing years earlier, in comedy.
The Ford Dealers of America present The Fred Allen Show.
For 5 years, starting in 1936, Wouk wrote jokes and sketches for the popular radio host Fred Allen. But after Pearl Harbor, the 26-year-old enlisted in the Navy and served in the Pacific. In his off-duty hours, he began to write a novel. Aurora Dawn got mixed reviews. His second book, City Boy, did worse, but The Caine Mutiny put him on the map. It won a Pulitzer Prize, it was a bestseller, and became a play and a movie.
When I finished The Caine Mutiny, I wrote in my diary, or my work journal, which I keep, I said, unless I'm mistaken, this is a good book, but it's not yet the war novel I mean to write.
It was the first in a run of ambitious books that included The Winds of War and War and Remembrance, each about 1,000 pages long. But war wasn't Wouk's only subject. He wrote about the publishing world, a fictional Caribbean island, and he tapped into his own heritage. He was born in New York City to Jewish immigrant parents. Out of that upbringing came Marjorie Morningstar, about a young girl trying to break into show business.
The Winds of War was made into a TV miniseries, got huge ratings in 1983. Starred Robert Mitchum, and I love Robert Mitchum, but the problem is his pug Henry wasn't his best role. It certainly wasn't Humphrey Bogart as Captain Queeg, and his co-stars were Ally McGraw and Jan Michael Vincent. And as I discussed in the Jan Michael Vincent podcast we did recently, probably should have gone with some different casting. But none of that should take away from the writing ability of Herman Wouk, and The Caine Mutiny will be a classic forever. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps, and as a final tribute to Herman Wouk, how about a little Ella?
If they asked me, I could write a book about the way you walk and whisper and look